Executing States' Rights. I'm Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle now. And Bill, the Trump administration has been trying to move forward with the execution of 4 or 5 federal convicts, and they are being blocked. The administration is being blocked by the courts. And in this particular case, a judge is saying that federal guidelines now that are in place for how to do lethal injection actually are inconsistent with a 1994 law that demands that the method of execution be consistent with that of the state in which the execution takes place. Now, Bill, in general, I know a lot of conservatives are in favor of the death penalty for a variety of reasons. Not everybody, but a lot of them are. And yet here is a judge essentially blocking administration of the death penalty for what might be called Federalist or Republican reasons, basically saying the federal government should not be mandating this technique across the country. Wherever you execute that prisoner, let's say it happens in Texas, you've got to use Texas's way of doing that. Do you find this to be an interesting quandary, or do you just think this is another attempt by the left to let criminals run free? Both.
My first thought on this was, wow, they're federal prisoners. So if they, since it's a federal issue, federal jurisdiction, but they have to physically execute these people in a certain location, so that makes it a state issue. I immediately said, wasn't that what the District of Columbia was supposed to be for? I mean, isn't that what D.C. is supposed to be? Not just another state that can bring in an electoral vote so it can vote Democratic. Wasn't the District of Columbia supposed to be essentially a tiny, tiny, tiny little square of federal territory that has federal rules and is not subject to any state government? Isn't that about right?
You know, I'm not enough of a constitutional scholar to rule on that question.
In any event.
But clearly there are some people on the left, particularly, who would like to block any and all executions of criminals, no matter how heinous the crime for which they were convicted. But in this case, the federal government, essentially the judge is saying the federal government overstepped its constitutional bounds by mandating this particular method of execution, which is not shared by all states, and that a defendant should have the right to defend themselves essentially in the place where the crime was committed or in the place where they were convicted of the crime.
Yeah, this is obviously seems to me to be pretty clear, just more of the left using the courts to accomplish what they can't accomplish through the legislative process of a representative democratic republic. If you can't convince people to buy something, then you simply make sure that they're not allowed to leave the store with it. And that's seems to be what's going on here. What's especially ironic about this, and I think, again, sometimes I think we talked about this in the last show, that sometimes the only way to defeat kind of frivolous stuff is to simply just get it over with. In the case of the impeachment thing, I said, march the charges over and dismiss them in 3 minutes. That's the appropriate response to that. In this case, I think what you're basically saying is the federal government has mandated execution by lethal injection, which by pretty much all accounts is significantly more humane than any of the alternatives. Certainly, if I found myself in that position, that would be the option I would like to take.
But there's actually more than one method of lethal injection.
Okay, but my point is, if the judge is arguing that it has to happen according to the rules of the state where it occurs, and if it turns out that some of those states use the electric chair or they use gas chamber or whatever the case may be, what the judge is essentially saying is that these prisoners are going to have to suffer more than what the federal government wants them to suffer for. Isn't that right?
Well, not exactly. I mean, I think it's not as clear cut as that about what's the preferable method of execution. It's really that any method of execution that the federal government chooses, if it were not in concert with the method in the particular state where the crime occurred or where that person was convicted, would be unconstitutional. And it's possible that the federal method is either more or less for want of a better term, more or less painful or cruel than it would be in any other state. So let's say in the state of California, you had a method that was a 3-drug cocktail that put you to sleep and then stopped your heart and then stopped your nervous system or whatever. So that's your method.
In Nevada, it's just a cocktail.
Yeah, and the federal government, and then the keys. But the federal government could agree that death by firing squad is the method, and you could say as a California prisoner, well, wait a minute, I committed my offense in California. I want to die with a 3-drug cocktail, not the firing squad. So in essence, the judge is saying, look, it's the 1994 law, which was a federal law, says that the prisoner must be executed in conformity with the method used by the state of that particular crime.
As usual, I realized I found that this whole argument is bogging us down and just generally muddying the waters when the actual answer is actually seems to be much more clear. And the question really is, truthfully, the question really is, are there federal crimes, yes or no?
Well, because and specifically when it comes to murder.
Because if there aren't federal crimes, then no one can be held by the federal government, because you cannot argue that they were held in a facility where the crime either was committed, or maybe this is where the guy grew up, or who knows, where his personal mailing address is. If there is no such thing as federal crime or federal prisoners, then that needs to be announced, and the entire society needs to be restructured. But if it turns out that there are federal crimes that have got nothing to do with state laws, then the federal government is responsible for the execution of those laws, and the states have nothing to say about it. And the fact that it may happen in a state is a specious argument. And this judge knows it. It's specious because it's not a state law.
It's the federal government that said that it has to be done in accord with the state method of execution. It's not the states who are rising up and asserting their dominance in this matter. The federal government passed this law in 1994 that said that that's how executions were to be carried out. And now, since then, now the administration, or at least the Justice Department, is saying, well, this is the new protocol for federal executions. And a judge is saying, wait a minute, you've already got a law on the books here that says it's got to be whatever Missouri does or whatever California does.
I'm sorry, I completely misunderstood that one.
No, that's okay. And let me give you an example, by the way.
But the argument doesn't change. The argument doesn't change. That original ruling, in my opinion, that ruling that said that this has to be done according to the way it would happen in the states where it would be actually instituted, that doesn't make sense to me. I think that earlier ruling is the ruling that doesn't make any sense to me. If it is a federal crime, then the federal government is responsible for the punishment, and they're responsible for the sentencing. And the sentencing in some cases includes the death penalty. And that means that the federal government is responsible for determining how that sentence is going to be passed out.
So instead of overturning or blocking the executions that the Trump administration is trying to carry out right now, it would be better to declare unconstitutional the 1994 law that mandated that the executions had to be carried out in a manner consistent with what was happening in the state.
Correct. Yes, that seems to make sense to me, because otherwise the entire issue of a federal crime becomes essentially meaningless. If it turns out that the law says that you've got to punish the federal prisoner in accordance with how the state law where the crime occurred took place, then that means that the sentencing guidelines are different in many states, and in virtually every state, that all of these people who may have killed, let's say 5 guys, let's say, who had formed a conspiracy to murder the president and actually killed some people, and it was a federal conspiracy, federal crime, prosecuted, all 5 of them were going to get the death penalty, let's say. Okay, so one guy was in California, one's in Texas, one's in Idaho, and so on. But so one of these states has outlawed the death penalty, let's say. So that guy gets to live. And then another guy gets a life sentence, but he's eligible for parole in 7 years, and another one he's not eligible for parole in 30. So that guy and the other guy get different justice. That to me is not justice. That to me is injustice. I think if you're going to have the entire idea of a federal statute and federal crime, and I'm not 100% sure that's a good idea, mind you,
Yeah, one wonders, and I don't have full details on these particular cases. They mention the murders these people committed, but it doesn't specifically say, traveled across state lines to commit a murder, or citizen of one state killing a person from another state, or an involvement with a foreign government or Indian tribe.
Yeah.
That doesn't have those classical definitions of why the federal government would be involved in something. But it does make one wonder why, if somebody's convicted of murder in Missouri, then it's not a state crime and a state punishment.
It might have something to do with co-conspirators or so on. I don't know enough about
or even violations of hate crimes, because that's a federal thing. Yeah.
I don't know enough about why these federal laws are in place, but I'm certainly willing to believe, until I see evidence to the contrary, that the entire reason that federal crimes, federal prisoners, and so on existed was because there were many cases that simply could not be handled by the states, because gosh, what's the word I'm looking for? It's almost like the ownership of the crime doesn't belong to any one state. The provenance, that's what I'm looking for. Yeah. So I suspect that's why these things were put in place. I want to say one more thing about the death penalty here. I read not too long ago about a case of a man who was executed in Texas for arson, and that all of the evidence used against him had later been shown by, not just for his case, but just in terms of general fire research, to be not only inconclusive, but in most cases wrong. Now, whether or not that man was innocent, I'm not here to say. I don't know enough details about the case, but let me just say one thing about this. We have a system that believes in innocent until proven guilty. As we just discussed on our right angle that we shot yesterday, the idea of a man getting a 12-year jail sentence for having a cell phone in the jail because the jail did not detect it and the guy had no idea it was a crime, that is an injustice. And my feeling on the death penalty is I'm completely in favor of the death penalty, but when I say there can be no doubt, I mean there can be essentially no doubt. There has to be, in my mind, there has to be a DNA match. There has to be either multiple reputable witnesses, because some of these guys, this guy in question as well, was largely convicted on the basis of a prison snitch who has every motivation to lie in order to get his sentence reduced. So all I'm saying is, I think that the horror of being executed by a state or the state is, I would say, probably certainly on the top of my list. And while I don't feel any remorse for people who have done activities and crimes so heinous that it warrants that penalty, I have an absolute determination personally and politically to make sure that if that penalty is applied, it's not just beyond any reasonable doubt. I think it has to be beyond doubt. I mean, it really does. This is my personal opinion on the issue, and obviously people are going to disagree with that. But that's what I wanted to say about that.
And final question on this, and this you've kind of touched on it a little bit already, so it probably won't take much to handle this. But going into an election year, the Trump administration is continuing to press a case about the federal death penalty, a real hot button issue for a lot of people on not only a political basis, but a moral basis. There are a lot of people who just believe that no matter how bad the crime was, involving the state or we the people in the execution of another person is a moral affront and should not be done. So we're going into an election year. What kind of, is this an issue you think that will be adjudicated at the ballot box as well? Is this something that Americans are split on? Or do you think the president has looked at this and said, yeah, this will not only appeal to my base, but this will reach out to a lot of other people who believe that criminals should get what's coming to them?
I'm not entirely sure that this president governs by polls. But put that aside, because the issue is a much more important one. I don't imagine that death penalty is going to be a hot topic issue for the 2020 election. And furthermore, if Donald Trump comes out in favor of federal executions for federal crimes, I don't think it's going to change a single vote. I can't think of a Trump supporter who's going to abandon him. And likewise, I can't think of any cases where a progressive voter would suddenly support him for this. The issue here is contemporary morality. And this is what drives me insane about watching these social justice warriors pulling down statues and accusing people of things that happened 200 years ago, whatever the case may be. Contemporary morality changes. Right and wrong doesn't change, but our attitudes towards punishment, our attitudes towards many things do change. Our attitude towards drunk driving has changed. Our attitude towards cigarette smoking has changed. Our attitude towards animal cruelty has changed. There are now laws on the books, for example, to protect animals against cruel use and behavior that would not have existed. In fact, probably would have been laughed out of the court 100 years ago. And I think those laws are necessary and good. Likewise, sensible regulations about not pumping mercury directly into a river, that also was not a crime 150 years ago, and now it is. And I'm in favor of that change. If it turns out that enough of the American people have decided that the death penalty is archaic, then that will be reflected through elections and work their way up into the society and the structure of the government. But that does not seem to be the case. And I think in America, things are looked at very differently here, not just by people just because of our cowboy background and so on. I think it's deeper than that. When you think about European countries where somebody would just gun down 4 or 5 people, and then they spend 7 years in a resort, basically, reading and just generally, relaxing, and then they're released. The Europeans look at this as a sign of their superior morality and their superior sophistication, but I don't see it that way at all. What I see when I see that kind of socialist sort of laxity about murder is I see societies that are so structured as a collective that what actually happened in their eyes is not that one irreplaceable, precious life has been taken and can never be brought back. It sounds more to me like one of the cogs has been removed, and so therefore we're going to have to replace it with another cog. And yes, you shouldn't have done that, and that was bad, and you slowed the machine down, but, I think 5 years ought to do it. I think this argument applies to abortion as well. I think that Americans have a more profound sense of the value of human life, more profound sense of individual life than any other people that I'm aware of on the earth. And this is, of course, what so apparently mystifies the left. If you're so respectful of human life, how can you be in favor of the death penalty? My response would be, I'm in favor of the death penalty because, in my opinion, there's nothing more heinous, reprehensible, or more worthy of the ultimate punishment than taking another human being's life. And I'll just add one last thing, since we don't talk about death penalty very often. It's a very, very, very quick point. If you're going to execute somebody for a crime that they deserve to be executed for, you should do it relatively quickly. And when I say relatively quickly, I mean long enough for a full appeal process and all of those safeguards to take place. But one of the things that's so alarming to me is that if you have a young man who murders somebody at 22, murders 3 people, let's say, and is given the death penalty, and deservedly so, and if this person stays in jail for 20 years, by the time they're 42, they're no longer the same person that committed the crime. In many cases, not all cases, but in many cases, they have genuinely reformed. They're simply not the person they used to be. And I have a real problem with that as well.
Ladies and gentlemen, these kind of conversations are made possible by the members at BillWhittle.com, a group of people who believes in open discussion and civil dialogue, and frankly has a lot of fun behind the scenes that you can't see because you're not yet a member at BillWhittle.com. So once you unlock new levels of engagement by becoming a member, you'll be able to see a comment section under every post we do. You'll be able to see the member written blog. You can write that member written blog. You can actually be a blogger on our website. You can unlock the member directory so you can communicate directly with other members, including myself, and even Bill's self. And you can send private messages to fellow members. It's really a group of people who have come together around a set of ideas that they want to advance around the world and believe in them so much that they've made a tangible commitment to it. We invite you to make that same commitment by going to BillWhittle.com and clicking that Become a Member link. And whether you're a member or not, if you've not yet signed up for our Caribbean cruise, May 15th through the 18th on the Royal Caribbean Navigator of the Seas, now's the time to do that. At a certain point, we're going to have to say no mas, and we won't be able to take any further bookings. So if you're on the fence about that, it's time to make that decision today. Click the link in the description below and book your cabin.
Come on, we'll have a blast. Yeah, come on.
It's going to be fun. For Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks for watching.